Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about a boy named Harold and his amazing purple crown. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I'm guessing a lot of you, like me, grew up with the children's book, Harold and the Purple Crown, written by Crockett Johnson in 1955. The book really has become one of the most beloved works in all of children's literature. The very charming narrative about the beauty of childhood imagination is very profound in its understated simplicity. So naturally, a bunch of Hollywood execs in a boardroom somewhere looked at that and thought, hey, that sounds good and all, but what if Harold was in fact live action and an adult and navigating the harsher realities of the real world in a movie filled with a bunch of noisy spectacle? So this is definitely a movie, not the movie that maybe you would expect if you were familiar with the original source material. And I will say, well, I do think some younger viewers will find some moderate enjoyment and amusement here. I think this the misguided decision to age up its characters as well as set the story in live action results in a movie that just lacks all the charm and subtlety that made its source material so beloved. And as it was probably obvious to anyone that saw the trailer for this or even just the poster for this movie, Harold and the Purple Crown, the movie, is not a direct adaptation of the book. And instead, the original kind of book story is recapped in what I think is a fun, opening sequence that is done in animation before announcing to the audiences that the story did not, in fact, end there. And to the misfortune of all the adults in the movie theater, it then proceeds to show a new adventure for Harold, who has now grown up, as well as his pals Moose and Porcupine, as they travel to the real world to look for the narrator, who is also their creator, who seems to have gone missing. And enjoyment, or lack thereof, of this movie will likely hinge heavily on just how viewers feel about that decision to adapt, cute little cartoon Harold into live action, not as cute adult actor Zachary Levi. And hey, if I had $1 for every time I reviewed a movie where Zachary Levi plays a child stuck in a man's body. And I will say, to his credit, as he did demonstrate in his very similar role in the comic book movie Shazam, I think Zachary Levi is arguably among kind of the Hollywood actors best suited for this type of role, although that doesn't necessarily mean that the role works or that there is sort of a seamless marriage between the two. And the main problem, at least to me, is not that the decision to, age up Harold fails to, honor the original book. I think the more immediate issue is just that it's simply not very much fun to watch an adult Levi act like a childish Harold. It does become a very one-trick pony gimmick that quickly wears out its welcome. Of course, I am also well aware that I am not the target audience for this film. I think despite an aged up cast, this movie remains a story aimed primarily at children and probably kind of on the younger spectrum of children. And I do think from that perspective, there are some moments of amusement that will please younger viewers as Harold wields the power of the Purple Crown just to create various fun things. Although, kind of oddly enough, movie version of Harold's sort of creative vision does seem almost entirely limited to methods of transportation, creating an airplane or a motorcycle or skateboards or a spare tire or roller skates, and really little else beyond that. And the final confrontation between Harold and the primary antagonist in this does come the closest to showcasing just the full range and vast potential of the Purple Crown. Although for most of this movie, the filmmakers just seem to lack the creative range as, the book version of Harold, and the film just doesn't utilize its most exciting element, which is the Purple Crown, nearly as often or inventively enough. And kind of as an aside, and I am fully aware that this might just be an adult nitpicking a kid's movie, but the movie's emphasis on the crown itself often seems almost contrary to the central point in the book, because in the book, the Purple Crown is in fact just that, a regular old Purple Crown, and really the true power to create endless worlds and set up, multiple adventures was in Harold's own imagination, whereas in the movie, the crown itself seems to possess some sort of power, even if the imagination is still required to make it work. And at times, the movie actually hints at some, I think, quite interesting, deeper themes and messages, including some that have, religious significance, but much like the movie as a whole, it's just rarely able to fashion its various squiggles and ideas into a clear picture. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, really not a whole lot, although maybe a few things just to be aware of. As far as language, there are two uses of like OMG, as well as just a few other like notable words, where a character says like "oh shoot" or refers to characters as being moron. And there's also a moment where a character uses like fictional invented language as what seems to be like a clear substitute for a profanity, starting with the letter S. As far as violence, there are several kind of shocking, gratuitous moments of violence and gore that I'm just kidding. This is Harold and the Purple Crown. There is no violence, thankfully, in this movie. Although there is perhaps something for sexuality, I don't think anything overly concerning, but there are a few scenes. For instance, there's a scene where kind of Harold very naively declares to another man about a woman that he's been seeing her a lot and that he spent the night at her house. And sort of the obvious implication is that the other man kind of wrongly assumes some sort of like sexual relationship is going on. There's another scene shortly after that, which takes place in a library where an author is doing a book reading which is focused on a passage that sort of emphasizes the hero's sculpted body and perfectly placed nipples. And kind of the only other thing that might come to mind for this is kind of at one point Harold and his friends, they leave like a public advertisement looking for their old man, which to them is what they call the narrator, their creator, and leave the number of that former woman for the old man to call, which just leads to a bunch of old men all across the city calling her up, looking for a relationship. A few other just sort of content things. I think, as is often the case in a movie like this, kids and their parents make plenty of just dubious decisions, including kids like skipping school to just go off alone with some strangers that he just met, or like sneaking out of the house at night. Just things, hey, as a parent, you don't necessarily want your kids to be mimicking. And the only other thing is like the villain who uses like the crown's power to turn himself into like a sort of wizard, makes the declaration, "Upon this rock I will erect my kingdom," which is like a clear allusion to Christ's own words to the Apostle Peter in Matthew 16:18. As far as themes, worldview, this thing's going on beneath the surface of this. Like I said, almost a surprising amount of at least hints at deeper, more interesting themes. Because at the very start of this film, Harold looks at his friends Moose and Porcupine, who were created by him with the Purple Crown, and he muses, "If I drew you, then who drew me?" And kind of in response, the voice of the narrator speaks to take credit, which leads Harold to ask further questions like, "Why can't I see you? And why did you draw me?" And I think these are almost surprisingly like philosophically and theologically rich questions with a very clear like application to faith. Even just sort of Tolkien's famous concept of subcreation came to mind for me, and the idea that like, we create because we ourselves are created in the image of a creator. But as probably expected, this film doesn't necessarily follow that path too far or resolve that tension in any real meaningful way. After all, the author, Crockett Johnson, who is also like the presumed narrator in the story, died in 1975, and he is a mortal, so he doesn't have like an eternal presence in the story. And in the final showdown, the villain taunts Harold that now he has no narrator to tell you what to do, to which Harold responds, "Well, I believe in me, and I believe in my friends." And hey, a healthy sense of just sort of self-belief is a fine message, in its own right. But I think as a continuation of the narrative thread about, sort of that spiritual search for our creator, the answer is just less satisfactory. But even so, although this film wasn't intended to be, a cohesive Christian allegory by any means, I do think parents can find elements that could spark deeper conversations with their kids. One other kind of underlining theme for this, which actually has a lot of similarities to even to like a movie like the Barbie movie, where there is sort of this idea motif of growing up, where the cartoon world comes to represent sort of childhood innocence, where the real world, represents the more like harsher realities of adult life. And over the course of the movie, Harold, he struggles to, cling on to some of those, his imagination and, that more idealistic stuff as he begins to learn about things like death and pain. Although ultimately, the movie seems to land and kind of push this idea that, there is still, great power, healing power in our imaginations for children and adults alike. So in the end, is Harold and the Purple Crown an awful movie? I don't think so. And I think with a brisk hour and a half runtime, it really doesn't drag on beyond the point of just sort of tolerance. And I think for kids looking for diversion, or just for exhausted parents looking for diversion on their behalf, this movie might be all that they need. And yet, for a movie about the power of creativity, it just feels oddly muted and uninspired. I think, sort of with his trusty purple crown and imagination, Harold could travel anywhere, but maybe it's best if he contained his adventures to the 2D realm of animated literature and just left the real world of Hollywood behind. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you go see this movie, you take your kids, love to hear what your kids thought of this thing. So jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation about it. If you have done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, got lots of other movie reviews or faith and pop culture podcast, interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide through a world for Christ.